Welcome back. This is Exodus Lesson 7, the Exodus. This is the week that the Israelites will begin their trip from Egypt to the Promised Land, and so it's called the Exodus. I'd like you to pause to say a prayer with your family, as well as say your memory verse, and show your parents that you completed your homework, and there are a few things that you will need to bring to the table this week. One is your pronunciation guide, and you'll need that probably a couple more times because as the Israelites move through the area that they will be going through, they'll be meeting peoples and going to places that will need to practice saying their names. Also, you'll need your What I Learned in Lesson 7 sheet with your pen or pencil, and you'll need your map to fill out for each week. Also on the screen, I will leave up 3 new names for you to pronounce this week. And when we come back, we'll see how you did with your pronunciation. All right, pause now. Did you get Etham, Pihahiroth, and Baal Zephon? You'll notice that Baal Zephon had 2 accent marks on it, one on the Bay part and the second on the Z part. So you have to put in 2 hard beats, Baal Zephon. So that was a little different this week, wasn't it? This week we're going to talk about the fact that Pharaoh finally decides to let the people go after the last plague, the death of the firstborn. You can imagine that that was pretty scary for them to have the death of the firstborn, and they, as a matter of fact, hurried to get the Israelites to leave their country. And so the people were told to be ready when they ate their Passover meal with their shoes on their feet, their belts fastened, and their staves, that's the plural of staff, in their hands, ready to go. And it's true that right after that, they had to get up and go before the bread in their kneading troughs even had a chance to rise, which was how they wound up eating unleavened bread at their Passover each year as a remembrance of that. Now remember that at this point, the Israelites are a huge nation. We talked about this once before. They are now a nation, it says, of 600,000 men, as well as women and children, and they had their flocks and herds too that had to travel. I looked up online to see how big different cities were and things like this. So the county of Travis, which has the city of Austin and a few other places like that in there, has 1,274,000 people. And the county of Williamson County, that has Cedar Park and Leander and places like that in it, has 590,000 people. So if you added those two together, it comes out to about 1,764,000 people. Well, that is probably about the size of the amount of people that had to travel in order to leave Egypt and go to the Promised Land. Can you imagine that? Try and make every single person in Travis County and Williamson County get up and start walking and herding animals and bringing children and all that. So it was a huge number of people that had to go. It's hard for us to imagine that, especially like in movies, they just show a lot of people going. Well, in a movie, they probably show you 100 or 200 people and you go, wow, that's a lot. No, this was well over 1 million, probably closer to 2 million people, plus all the animals that they had to bring along. Let's look at our map. The Israelites started their journey to the Promised Land from around the area of the city of Ramses in the country of Egypt. The first place that they traveled to was the city of Sukkot, and then to Etham, and then they went down to cross the Red Sea. You see a little question mark on my map where the crossing is because no one really knows. After all these many years since it happened, the rivers have changed course, the land is a different shape, and the cities of Pihahiroth and Baal Zephon are no longer there, so no one is exactly sure where the crossing took place. But we do know that as they traveled down here, their backs were to the sea. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that God had them go down this way towards Mount Sinai because he did not want them to take the direct route across here to Canaan. This is Canaan, where they eventually settle right here. You can see the Dead Sea and the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee in there, and this is where they would go. So this would have been a much shorter trip for them. But God was protecting his people because they had had left slavery in Egypt, and it would have been very difficult and very discouraging for them to have to fight a war all the way through here against the Philistines before they got to Canaan. Now I want you to look at your scale of miles here and see that on the part of their journey, they probably went about 25 miles to the city of Succoth. Then they went maybe 15 miles to Etham. And then down here to the Red Sea, they probably went another 20 to 25 miles. Now, the average walking distance for a full-grown man in Bible times, what they called a day's journey, was approximately 20 to 25 miles. They think it's about 24 miles. So it probably took them at least 3 days to get here. But remember, they also had small children traveling with them, and they had to bring their herds and flocks also. So it probably took them longer than 3 days before they were here to the Red Sea, where they were stopped by the huge body of water that was there. So it was at least 3 days, I would think, before Pharaoh started sending his men after them. One thing I want you to think about is 4 times in Exodus 13 it says that they are to remember by a strong hand that the Lord brought you out of Egypt. So what does that mean by a strong hand? After all, God doesn't have hands, feet, arms, legs, so he is a spirit. So what does it mean with a strong hand? It's a word picture for us. God gives us word pictures in the Bible to help us understand concepts and ideas and help us to understand about God. It is hard to think of God because he's a spirit, but when we think of him, for example, in Deuteronomy 23:14, it says that God walked among the camp of the Israelites. Well, since he didn't have feet or legs, he wasn't literally walking with them, but it's a picture for us that he was with them, that they were his people, that he was glad to be around them, that where they were, he was, and it was a very comforting thought for them. So in a likewise way, when we think of a strong hand, we think of something like a dad. When a child falls down and he reaches out his strong hand, his strong and loving hand, and helps that child to get up. A strong hand has to do with not just the strength of it, but the loving kindness that goes with it and the helpfulness. So God loved them and cared for them and wanted to help them. In other places, it talks about God's strong arm. When it talks about the strong arm, that is really a talk mostly about God's power and might. But here the strong hand talks about the loving relationship. I want you to look at Psalm 136, verses 10 through 16 with your family now and discuss the relationship between God's strong hand and his love for us. All right, pause now. Unfortunately, when Pharaoh has come to the realization that all the Israelites are gone and there is no slave labor left to do all the work that there is to be done in Egypt, he changes his mind again and decides to send the army and his chariots and his chosen chariots after the Israelites to force them to come back. Now, you've got to understand that in those days, a chariot and a chosen chariot was even a more fearsome thing, were kind of like the tanks of the day. And so when the people of God were standing with their backs to the Red Sea and looking out in the distance and saw not only an army marching towards them, but all these chariots coming too, it was a very frightening sight. Unfortunately for them, they let their fear drive out their faith. And the first thing they started doing was murmuring or complaining. Sometimes in today's language, we use the word murmur to mean talking in a low voice or quietly about to somebody about something. But this is the kind of murmuring that's like, I can't believe God brought us here, and I can't believe that we're going to be killed here. And not only did they murmur, but they complained loudly to Moses and said, why did you bring us out here to die? So the thing is that they let their fear destroy their faith. Now, we can be afraid, and there's nothing wrong with being afraid, but we need to remember that God is on our side and will help us through all our difficult times. And Moses tells the people, he says in the King James Version, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Well, this is an interesting expression. Your Bible might say stand firm instead of stand still, but the idea is the same. After all, at the very next verse, he tells them to move forward towards the sea, even before he tells Moses to raise the rod and hold it over the sea to part the sea. They had no idea God was going to part the sea for them when he commanded them to move. So stand still has nothing to do with where their feet are or what they're doing. It has to do with the comforting nature of knowing that God is always there. We might say, get a grip. Have faith in God. Trust him. Don't give up. Don't quit believing because one hard thing has happened. They should have remembered that God has done all these miracles for them up to this point, and God could provide another miracle if it was necessary. So the people, it says in Hebrews 11:29 that the people did move forward towards the sea, and that showed that their faith, they moved forward by faith towards the Red Sea. So they wound up having obedient faith. They just needed to be reminded by Moses that God was with them and would be with them. I want you to think about this. So we got all these people, these flocks and herds, and God parts the Red Sea so that it is like a wall of water on one side and a wall of water on the other side. And they crossed the ground as if it was dry ground. God made the ground dry for them. You can imagine being at the bottom of the river, that if God just moved the water out of the way, it'd be kind of mucky and sloppy and hard to walk through. But God provided for them even more by providing the firm ground for them to walk on. And so they crossed over, and Pharaoh's army tried to do the same thing, except that God held them off for a while. God provided the cloud by day and the fire by night, the pillar, to prevent the Egyptians from entering the Red Sea until the people of God had gotten through there. And then the Egyptians entered, and of course, some versions say the chariot wheels fell off. Some said that they were clogged, but at any rate, the chariots were disabled. They couldn't go quickly through the river. And the soldiers that were going through, when the river waters came back together, they were drowned. And God provided for his people. So the discussion question for this week that I'd like you to consider is, some modern scholars say that the crossing of the Red Sea was not really a miracle. Seems like they've had this idea before about the plagues. Well, anyway, they say that parts where the Red Sea could be crossed were so shallow that a really, really strong wind might sort of push the water back a little bit, and that they could have crossed over right there. And that's not really a miracle, that these things happen nowadays, that if you have a trickle of water, a big wind can come and push it out of the way. Well, I want you to talk about with your parents, how do you know from the scriptures that you've read about the parting of the Red Sea, how do you know for sure that this was a miracle from God? Because the evidence is all there, isn't it? We don't need any scholars to tell us it wasn't a miracle. We can tell that it is. All right, I'll see you next week. I hope you enjoyed your lesson today. Bye-bye.